we talk about stories, we often talk about genre. But genre can mean quite a few different things. Genre can be about the setting of a story, like sci-fi or fantasy or a Western, all of which are really the same basic stories of good versus evil. Just one is set in space with aliens, one is set in castles with witches and dragons, and one is set in Colorado with cowboys and six-shooters. And all these have the same problems of generally affirming colonization, aggressive images of masculinity, and passive images of femininity. Or we might think of genre in terms of form, like poetry, theater, prose novel, creative nonfiction, movie, or serial television. And any one of these genres can be Western or sci-fi or fantasy. A third way of thinking about genre is through the plot. And that's what I want us to focus on today. So when we think about genre based on plot, this is what gives us things like the rom-com or drama or crime fiction, and even to some extent horror. But the idea of genre classification around plot reached its high point with archetypal literary criticism. Northrop Frye's 1957 work, The Anatomy of Criticism, took basic plots and divided them down into all sorts of subcategories based on whether the story was about gods or people, people in the past or people in the mundane world, and whether the story ended happily or sadly, and so on. Now, if you do advanced literary studies, you'll find that literary theorists and critics have, in many ways, moved beyond these sorts of archetypal structures. But they're still kind of assumed as starting points for thinking and talking about how stories work and how they relate to each other, especially when we start to talk about genre that is shaped by the plot. And this archetypal thinking about stories really starts out pretty easily, okay? So all stories have plots. And whether it's like an epic poem set in space or a British crime drama with a romantic comedy twist, all stories end in one of two basic ways: happily or not so happily. And from this huge generalization, we get two types of stories: comedy and tragedy. Now, despite the way that we use the term comedy, comedies in this sense really have like nothing to do with making the audience laugh. A story is a comedy because it ends happily. And by happily, what we mean is that it ends with like marriage and babies and all sorts of things that in real life may not be happy at all. But in stories, they signify reconciliation and union and new life. And so marriage and babies are classic symbols for reconciliation and new life. And then tragedies, on the other hand, they end not so well, right? So typically in a tragedy, everyone, or at least all the characters we care about, are dead. Sure, their deaths might open new possibilities, like when Fortinbras comes at the end of Hamlet and establishes what promises to be a less incestuous and more stable government. And yes, the Capulets and the Montagues decide to stop fighting after Romeo and Juliet are both dead, but these both seem like small consolation, since all of our favorite characters are now dead, and the hope for new life and good government is more of like a wish than a realized promise. But it's important to recognize that while comedy endings in marriage give us concrete examples of reconciliation and promises of life and generation and creativity, tragedies don't exactly foreclose on those possibilities. In fact, it's through death and the carnage of tragedy that some sort of new hope is actually born. And this sense of good, like that some nobility is revealed even amid all the death of tragedy, is what Aristotle calls catharsis. It's that sense of like emotional cleansing that comes with seeing something noble and good revealed, despite the evil and brokenness of the world. So in a way, even tragedies have redemptive endings when they're at their best. But then this starts to raise a question, right? Like, what is the real opposite of these classical endings that still all hint at hope, even if it costs the lives of beloved characters to get there? Like, what's the opposite of hopeful generative endings, even if they're achieved through death? What, like, for example, are stories that end in marriage, but the marriage is clearly cold and self-serving, and they replace creative production like art or children with animosity and sterility? Like, what do we call those stories? Or what about stories that end with like ambiguity, where there's like marriage and life coupled with death? Or what about like that nihilistic humor that seems to push against any possibility of anything? So to comedy and tragedy, people had to add other things like romance and satire and absurdism. But even as we make all of these additional classifications, we just confirm how much of the ending of the story really matters. You see, more than anything, we need the end of the story to tell us, what the rest of the story means. So just imagine for a moment. What if Voldemort had won in Harry Potter? Or what if he'd lost, but Harry had stayed dead? They'd have been pretty horrible stories, and no one would have loved them with either of those endings. In fact, readers would be pretty angry that they'd spent years of their lives investing in the wizarding world only to have the Dark Lord triumph. I mean, we almost felt that way with Dobby's death, right? Or think of Star Wars. What if in Episode 9, we learned that Kylo Ren really was unredeemable, and he goes on to kill Rey and the Empire triumphed? I mean, that would have been a horrible 40 years of fandom and billions of dollars of merchandise that would be wasted in the light of that ending. But this doesn't mean that stories have to end happily to be meaningful or brilliant or successful. So let's think of some stories like maybe Death of a Salesman or The Glass Menagerie or Waiting for Godot. If you don't know these plays, they all end with bleak inaction. In Death of a Salesman, Willie, who's the salesman, he's dead by suicide at the end, and no one apart from his family really cares, and honestly, even they seem underwhelmed by his death. In The Glass Menagerie, no one gets married, nobody gets out or seems to find fulfillment, except for Tom, who leaves, but we don't know really to what end. And then the candles are just blown out. And in Waiting for Godot, Vladimir and Estragon, they talk while waiting for a train that never comes. They wrestle with their existential angst, think about suicide, but take no action because they just lack a rope. And then finally, the curtain falls. These are hard stories. They are powerful and sad and bleak representations of modern life. And they're brilliant in their bleakness, and they point from the beginning to an end that was all about bleakness. But if they had ended differently, all the power would be lost from the story, right? They'd be sentimental or cheap, or they would just feel wrong, like the ending didn't match the story. So endings matter a lot. But not just because they seem to fit with the story or are predictable. Endings actually tell us how to read everything that comes earlier in the story. Because you see, at the end, we know who the real bad guys are, and we know who the real heroes are. We know at the end which actions prove wise and which actions pave the way for redemption, but we also know which characters prove untrustworthy and devious, and which actions prove destructive. With the ending in place, we know which characters are worth our respect and which aren't. We start to learn which risks are worthwhile and which are not. But here's the thing, until we know the story and the ending, all of our readings are provisional and they might prove wrong. Similarly, we can endure all sorts of twists and turns in a story where we know the characters we love end up happy and in good places at the end of the story. So in Harry Potter, we only understand Neville's role in the novels in its entirety at the end, when he kills Nagini and breaks Voldemort's final Horcrux. And we only read Ron and Hermione's relationship as growing love once we know that they are together. Of course, for many of you, you probably never had that experience because of being surprised when the two get together because you knew it all along, because you read the books after they were already well known. But when you read it for the first time, it's really an inexplicable relationship until you go back and can see it. And so, while we all hate spoilers, a really good ending shouldn't actually ruin the text. It should force us to reread the text. In fact, knowing the ending ought to always make a good text better and more interesting, not worse. So if you want a really simple definition of what makes a good story or a literary story, the most simple test is the rereading or rewatching test. Does the story become more meaningful, and do you see new things because you know the ending? And does the ending make sense of the whole in a surprising way? If so, it's probably decent literature. The second reasons stories matter in their endings is that the ending determines what sort of story one is in and whether it leads us to joy or despair. No matter how funny no matter how enjoyable and how much love and goodness comes in the story. If it ends with all the characters being revealed as frauds, if it ends with their suffering and the suffering of others and destruction, if it ends with just self-serving and arrogant sterility, it isn't a joyful, good story. Despite all the humor, it really isn't truly a comedy, if that's the ending. But no matter how hard the journey, no matter how much death and destruction there is along the way, no matter how much people suffer, if the story leads to new life, to redemption and to joy and to peace, well, we tend to say that's a good story. In classical terms, it's a comedy, especially if it ends with a marriage. So by this measure, the epilogue in Harry Potter makes the series a comedy because the ending brings healing and goodness and marriage and literal new life in the next generation of wizards, despite Fred, Tonks, Lupin, Sirius, Dumbledore, and Dobby's deaths, along with a lot of others. And the Harry Potter series is joyful overall because good wins, and the community is redeemed from darkness. We see the same thing in Star Wars, right? Even with Luke, Leia, and Han dead, there's a sense of profound goodness at the end of the final episode when Rey declares that she is Rey Skywalker. So this begs the question, what sort of story are we as humans in? So one of the lovely things about the Bible is that it gives us multiple glimpses at the end of the human story. Now, these eschatological visions reveal what sort of place the universe is destined to become. They offer images of peace and wholeness. And they promise that at the very end of creation's story, all shall be well. So this means that despite its reputation for violence and suffering and tribulation and judgment, John tells us in Revelation that he saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and earth had passed away, and there was no longer the sea. And he sees the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And he hears a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. And they will be his people, and God himself will be their God. And he will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain. For the old order of things has passed away." And he says, "I am making everything new." So at this ending of the human story, the ending of the universe's story, we have that archetypal image of marriage, a wedding feast that declares cosmic reconciliation between God and God's people. But it isn't just a vision that's good for people. Notice that the whole of the heavens and the earth are made new. And the sea, which is this classic symbol of chaos, it no longer exists because chaos no longer exists. Whatever else is happening between right now and that final vision, we can start to make sense of the story we're in because we know that the story has a fundamentally good ending. But this ending isn't just in Revelation. Throughout the prophets, we see similar images of goodness and flourishing depicted in agrarian terms. So in Micah, we see many nations will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob." And then he goes on to say, they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Notice these are weapons of war being changed into agricultural weapons or tools. It says, "Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore." And then this is my favorite part. "Everyone will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid. For the Lord Almighty has spoken." That's a profound image of peace in the land, both military peace, but also the peace of your own fig tree, right? Enjoying the fruit of your own land. And it's not just in Micah. The prophet Joel writes that the pastures in the wilderness become green. Trees bear fruit, The fig tree and the vine, their riches. And he goes on to say, the threshing floors will be filled with grain. The vats will overflow with new wine and oil. Again, these images of abundance and life, right? Greenness and the garden restored. And the prophet Amos says something similar. New wine will drip from the mountains and will flow from the hills. And those who were in exile will be brought back. They will rebuild the ruined cities and live in them. They will plant vineyards and drink their wine. They will make gardens and eat their fruit. And then in Joel, in that day the mountains will drip new wine, and the hills will flow with milk. All the ravines of Judah will run with water. Like the image in Revelation, all of these images are images of incredible flourishing. Did you notice the abundance of new wine, of grain, and of clean water, of oil and fruit? These are images of feasting, but they're also images of security, right? There's no one to fear. A house is one's own. A person can enjoy the work of their hands. Notice too, these are profoundly material or thingy images. There's no harps or clouds. This is a very real vision of goodness and prosperity and peace. And in the prophets, that vision of the end of the story where all is well, it isn't just for the rich, and it isn't built at the expense of the poor. In fact, that's part of the point. The goodness and the peace, they're for the whole community. These visions of the ending of the story are images of home. They draw on that deep archetype from exile of a place where evil isn't the way of the world and the way it's supposed to be, where we don't feel like we are on the margins or alienated from the community, where we don't feel our loyalties being tried, and where we aren't forced to ceaselessly resist and subvert broken social and political and cultural systems that destroy the human person. These are visions of something fundamentally different from exile. They're images of that longed-for home that some of us have known, or that some of us have never known, but that our souls still long for. So why does this glimpse of the ultimate end of the story matter so much? Well, because no matter how bleak the world is, no matter how much we suffer or how far from home we feel, no matter how hopeless things look or how impossible our problems seem, death and despair are not the final word. The story's ending begins with God rending the heavens and joining in our suffering, joining in our exile through the person of Jesus. But even that isn't the end. The real ending is the universe set right and made new. The final vision is marriage and new life. The final vision is feasting and joy. And so for all its horrible and painful moments, the story we're in is a good one. It is a comedy in that best and most glorious sense of the word. And knowing that even, and perhaps especially in the darkness, knowing that we might just find the energy and the courage to keep pressing on toward home.